now we're going to be open for questions, and please feel free.
We'll get a few questions, shall we? And then gather them up.
It's all right. We were that stimulating, weren't we? You're all tired?
Can you talk more about this concept of virtual migration, offshoring of migration happening around the world? For example, the government workers in Bangladesh is actually the offshoring migration to another country. But then what are the rules and regulations?
One more.
Thank you very much. Very interesting panel. As you were all discussing, I was wondering whether the environment, so you brought up the issue of food security, and another is UN-led global governance issues around climate change. So I was wondering whether that could also be another governance, global governance scheme through which it's tied to development. Obviously, private sector interests, and so on and so forth. So just wondering if that could also be another lens to look at some of those issues.
I would be interested to hear something about the role of the European Union in the global development process.
Yes. Thank you. I think I will just pick up one question about this, the linkage between immigration and emigration. Now, I said in my presentation that there are two ministries handling this issue. That is where the whole problem comes in. For example, the immigration number, what we have right now is that India is vertically both the country of origin, country of destination, and also country of transit. All are happening in one place. All are happening in one place. In fact, our understanding what we have is we have 5 million people from other countries are working in India. This is again maybe estimates because government is silent on that and we don't have any database on that. Only government collects. When we ask them that, they say it is very confidential. So when it is confidential, we don't get anything. So, but we have some data talking about around 5 million, but there is no governance issue, except we have some problem with the Bangladesh and India migration. We have always some problematic issues. Otherwise, it is also like the immigration. We are silent on that, just like a status quo.
Virtual migration is very interesting, and I just was on a great panel, a session this morning where Kieran, I can't remember her surname, was she here? Hello? Hello? Okay. So I was in a session this morning where somebody presented a paper on BPO call centres in India and made exactly that case. Kieran, I can't remember her surname, but she argued these are virtual migrants, right? They don't leave India, but they go to pockets that are, almost like pockets of Western development. And so that was in the call centres. But yeah, you can make the case as well as others have about workers who are incorporated into the global economy and are kind of pulled into that space, but don't actually move out of the country. The issue about the role of the EU is interesting because in some ways some people look at the EU as a great example, in terms of migration and lack of borders and all of these kinds of agreements. But as I'm sure other panelists will refer to, there are ways in which those kinds of formations end up creating new kinds of enforcements and pushing those enforcement mechanisms perhaps out to the edges of that particular space, but stamping on to that space new kinds of enforcements and new kinds of restrictions. And so it's interesting to think about that, because I think a lot of people did think about the EU as an interesting example that one could replicate.
Just to quickly pick up around the idea of climate change. I mean, I think climate change is an interesting example because scholars of global governance would argue that sort of multilateralism and institutional frameworks form when there's a problem that states are better off solving together than separately, right? And so climate change seems to be one of those that should behoove a kind of approach under that realm. But we've seen real difficulty in having that happen, right? And then also to be able to have the concerns with vis-a-vis migration dealt with within that realm of climate change have been particularly challenging. And the current system to protect refugees worldwide, we know, does not work well in the case of climate or environmental migrants. And so moving forward, I think, yes, issue linkage and bringing trying to bring migration into discussion of climate change might be a valuable place to try to make sure that migration is addressed and that these types of migrants are addressed. But my worry is again a kind of dilution of and a watering down of the concerns vis-a-vis migration because it's going to be embedded in this larger other sort of more prominent and more palatable, frankly, set of political agendas around climate.
Yeah, if I could just try and draw two of the questions together through a different connecting mechanism. If I had had the time to talk about all of these areas of commonality or perceived commonality, one of the ones I would have focused on is what's known as the root causes doctrine. And the root causes doctrine is a kind of article of faith in much EU thinking about the relationship between migration and development. Now, what it suggests is that the root causes of migration from the south are things like rural poverty and disintegration. And what development must do is address those root causes. That's what the EU says. So we'll give development aid, address the root cause of migration, and then it'll reduce the migration pressure from the global south into Europe. There's very little, actually, empirical evidence for this, as Stephen Castles has pointed out in his writing. But as I say, it remains an article of faith. Now, very recently, there's been a new root cause introduced into the argument, and that is climate change. Climate change is now seen primarily within migration development discourse, and also to some extent, insofar as migration is talked about within the climate change world. It's seen precisely in these terms as a root cause forcing more people out of areas that they were living in. The other point I'd make, which connects these two, is that I've done a bit of work recently looking at why it is that the EU is kind of bent on forming what they call mobility partnerships with other blocks of states, particularly in the global south. And it's done it with individual countries such as India and with blocks of states such as the African Union. And if you look at these mobility partnerships, what you'll find is all of these basic areas of agreement that one sees in the migration development discourse all laid out one by one. There they are. And the common interest of both sides, in this case, say, the AU and the EU, is both believe in the root causes doctrine, because one believes that it will reduce migration flows, and the other believes that it will induce greater flows of overseas development or official development assistance.
I don't have much to add, just that I do think that climate change related displacement is on the agenda in these discussions around the global governance of migration, it's sometimes posited in the kind of crisis terms. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of the formalization, beyond the kind of estimates of statistics, that sometimes have reminded me of the way that Rajan was talking about the 25. I remember there's a UN report that came out several years ago that estimated that there would be 25 to 50 million people displaced due to environmental factors, climate change, but there wasn't a lot of information about how that estimate had come about. So how that becomes formalized will be interesting to watch. And then the EU, like Margaret said, is such an important case, like the case for studying the regional management of migration, whatever you consider to be the region of the EU itself, or its larger neighborhood, as it likes to call it, and the sort of geopolitical exercises in influencing migration management, farther and farther away through these mobility partnerships. But it's both, the success story and also kind of, also the place where all these things may well be unraveling before our eyes when I look at issues around asylum and detention and the infighting that's going on among, for example, EU member states and its neighboring countries around who manages migration, who invests resources, what the consequences are, and so on. So I think it's instructive in many different ways.